The year is 1940, mid-January, deep in the Karelian Isthmus, a frozen battleground between Finland and the Soviet Union. The cold is not just temperature, it is a force. It clamps around your lungs, stiffens your fingers, and erases the line between breath and pain. Thermometers have already surrendered at minus 43 degrees Celsius, minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. In the long record of modern warfare, few places have killed more efficiently than these forests during the Winter War. On one side of the front, thousands of Soviet soldiers crouch in their trenches. They have the might of an empire behind them, thick coats, fuel trucks, roaring campfires blazing into the void. Yet by dawn, hundreds will be found motionless, only inches from their own flames. They did everything right, and still the cold devoured them. Across that same frozen night, hidden beneath snow-draped branches, Finnish soldiers sleep, not huddled together, not feeding a fire every few minutes, not fighting for warmth. Next to them burns something strange. 2 or 3 horizontal logs, glowing softly, almost silently. No towering flames, no frantic feeding, just a slow, pulsing core of heat that lasts 12 hours untouched. For decades, modern experts stared at diagrams of this fire and dismissed it. They called it primitive. They called it unstable. They insisted that heat rises, so a horizontal fire must be flawed. They were wrong. The Finns, and the Siberian hunters before them, understood something we no longer do. They understood thermodynamics not from textbooks, but from generations of necessity. They understood the Nodia, the Rakovalkia, the long fire, a medieval design that breaks every rule we think we know about staying warm. Welcome to Historia Prime. Today we're not just revisiting history, we're uncovering a lost technology. We'll break down how this unlikely fire burned through sub-zero nights, why it outperforms modern gear, and what it teaches us about survival, ingenuity, and the ancient wisdom we've quietly abandoned. Stay with me. What you're about to learn may change the way you see fire forever. Part 1. The Mathematics of Freezing. To understand why this medieval fire was more than a clever trick, why it was, in truth, a piece of survival engineering, we first need to confront the brutal mathematics of freezing. Cold is not just an environmental condition, it is a physics problem. And for most of us today, it is a problem we solve poorly. Every year, the Centers for Disease Control reports more than 1,000 hypothermia deaths in the United States alone. What should trouble us is not the number itself, but who is dying. Many of these victims weren't careless. They weren't unprepared. They had good gear, the kind stamped with impressive temperature ratings and marketed as foolproof protection. Yet in 2023, a hiker in the White Mountains froze to death inside a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures. The gear did not fail its specification. The biology failed the gear. A sleeping bag does not generate heat. It can't. It only traps what you produce. And when exhaustion drains the body, when dehydration slows the metabolism, when injury disrupts circulation, the internal furnace falters. Modern gear is passive. The cold is not. In a contest between the two, nature tends to win. Now consider the standard campfire, the teepee fire, the picture-perfect flame every beginner learns to build. It is warm, yes. It is comforting, but the moment temperatures plunge into the deep negatives, this fire reveals a fatal flaw. Finnish soldiers had a name for it, the campfire curse. Your face burns as if pressed against an oven door, while your back remains frozen stiff. You spend the night rotating, absorbing heat on one side while losing it on the other, never truly warm, never truly resting. The fire seems powerful, yet it leaves you exhausted and vulnerable. The problem is simple physics. Convection. Hot air rises. And in a teepee fire, 80 to 90% of all heat energy shoots straight upward into the empty sky. The warmth you need radiates away from you instead of toward you. And to maintain even that inconsistent warmth, the fire demands constant tribute. In temperatures near -20 degrees Fahrenheit, a standard fire consumes a full log roughly every half hour. To sleep for 8 hours, you must first cut, split, and haul 16 to 20 large logs. Hard labor that burns precious calories your body desperately needs to conserve. If you stop feeding the fire so you can sleep, you risk freezing. But if you remain awake to feed it, the cold will eventually take you through exhaustion. Either path leads toward the same edge. Yet centuries before the Winter War, the indigenous people of the boreal forests, the Sami, the Khanty, the Mansi, the Siberian trappers, had already solved this impossible equation. They realized the cold could not be fought with sheer force or frantic effort. It demanded precision, not power. It demanded geometry, not flame. They discovered that a fire doesn't need to be big to be warm. It only needs to be built right. And that insight, quiet, counterintuitive, born from generations of observation, set the stage for the invention of a fire so efficient, so enduring, that modern experts dismissed it as impossible. They could not believe something so simple could outperform the best tools of the industrial age. But as the Finnish soldiers later proved, it could. And it did. In the next section, we'll look at how this fire was engineered and why it bends the rules of heat and combustion in ways that still surprise scientists today. Part 2. The engineering of the long fire. Now that we understand why ordinary fires fail in deadly cold, we can finally turn to the solution. One so elegant, so counterintuitive that entire armies overlooked it while indigenous hunters and Finnish scouts relied on it for centuries. Across regions, it carries different names. In Russia, it is the Nodia. In Finland, the Rakovalkia, literally the slit fire. In the American frontier, George Washington Sears, better known as Nessmuk, simply called it the long fire. At first glance, it looks almost too simple to matter. Two massive logs laid horizontally, one resting on the other, separated by a narrow gap of just a few inches. No pyramid of sticks, no towering flame, no frantic feeding of wood, just a quiet, glowing seam of heat. But simplicity is deceptive because the engineering inside that glowing seam is sophisticated. Unlike a teepee fire, which wastes most of its heat by sending it straight upward, the long fire behaves like a medieval radiator. Its power comes from a concept in radiative physics known as the view factor. When the two inner faces of the logs burn, they don't flare, they glow, emitting deep red infrared radiation. And because these faces stare directly at each other, that radiation doesn't escape into the sky. It ricochets back and forth, amplifying itself inside the narrow chamber. What forms between those logs is not a flame in the traditional sense. It is a razor-thin furnace, a blade of heat that grows hotter and hotter until temperatures inside the gap surpass 800 degrees Celsius. That energy doesn't drift upward. It projects outward in a clean, horizontal wall of warmth, straight toward the person lying beside it. In the brutal silence of a -40 degrees Fahrenheit night, that matters. Because radiant heat travels in straight lines. It does not care how cold the air is. It bypasses convective loss almost entirely, warming your entire length evenly, from your boots to your collar, while the outside world remains a killing field of frozen air. But if the engineering of heat is impressive, the engineering of time is genius. That narrow gap restricts oxygen just enough to prevent runaway flames. The wood doesn't blaze, it smolders. It breaks down through slow pyrolysis, releasing gases that burn steadily and predictably. And because the logs are thick, 8 inches or more, the burn progresses at a measured pace. The result is extraordinary. 10 to 12 hours of steady heat with no intervention. No getting up every hour. No stumbling through the dark for more wood. No collapsing from exhaustion. Just deep, uninterrupted sleep in conditions that should kill you in minutes. This isn't just a fire, it is a machine built from geometry, physics, and the quiet wisdom of people who observe the world carefully enough to understand what most of us never question. 2 logs, 1 gap, 12 hours of life. And in the Winter War, this simple technology became a thermal shield that saved thousands. In the next part, we'll explore how to build it correctly, because one mistake can ruin the entire design, and one detail can make the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Part 3. The Lost Art of Construction. So the question becomes, how do you actually build this thing? Because if you pick up most modern survival manuals, you'll notice they treat the long fire as a footnote, a diagram, a suggestion, but not an art. And that is the first mistake. This fire is deceptively simple, yet like all technologies born from centuries of trial and error, its power hides in the smallest details. To rebuild it correctly, we turn to the archives of legends like Mors Kochanski, the Canadian bushcraft master, and to the written accounts of Siberian trappers who depended on this fire for survival long before the Winter War. Their notes reveal the anatomy of a long fire that works every single time. It begins with choosing the right wood. You need dead, standing timber, trees that dried upright, naturally seasoned by wind and sun. Wood lying on the forest floor is heavy with moisture and rot. Pine and spruce are common in the boreal forest, but those who truly understood this method preferred aspen or any available hardwood because they burn cleaner and produce fewer sparks. From that timber, you cut 2 logs, each about the length of your body, roughly 6 feet. This isn't a guideline, it's a survival rule. If your fire is shorter than you, parts of your body will slip outside the radiant heating zone, and in sub-zero conditions, that is a fast road to frostbite. The logs must also be thick, at least 8 inches in diameter, because anything smaller simply won't last the night. And here is where the craft separates the masters from the amateurs. You never stack round logs directly on top of each other. If you do, the moment the bottom log burns, or the top one shifts, it can roll off and crush your legs, or worse, extinguish itself in the snow. The Siberian hunters solved this elegantly. They used their axe to flatten the top of the bottom log and the underside of the top log. This created a stable platform. Then, running the length of each log, they carved a subtle groove, a shallow channel that held embers, increased surface area, and ensured a consistent burn. This small channel is one of the forgotten secrets that makes the fire efficient rather than chaotic. To ignite it, you don't light the wood from below. You light it between the logs, inside the narrow gap. That gap must be held open with care. Stakes driven into the ground keep the logs aligned. Wedges carved from green wood hold the top log at the perfect distance. Into that gap you stuff birch bark, twigs, slivers of fat wood, anything rich in resins. When you light it, your goal is not to create a bonfire. You're coaxing a coal bed into existence, a glowing engine between the logs. Once it takes, the physics does the rest. The top log burns downward, the bottom log burns upward, and the ashes that form act like insulation, pushing the heat outward in a steady plane. There is also a variation for times when the forest doesn't give you thick trees. It's called the 3-log Nodia. 2 logs on the bottom, 1 on top. This creates a stable V-shaped channel that is easier to ignite, harder to collapse, and remarkably resistant to wind. Frontier novices loved it. Siberian trappers relied on it when options were scarce. It may not burn as long as the 2-log version, but in the deep cold, reliability is everything, and that is the true beauty of the long fire. It is not brute force, it is precision. Every cut, every groove, every inch of spacing transforms this simple structure from a pile of wood into a machine of survival. One engineered not by laboratories, but by centuries of human intuition. In the next part, we'll return to the Winter War and uncover how this medieval engineering shaped the battlefield and saved entire Finnish units from a fate the Soviets could not escape. Part 4. The Winter War and the Barrage Fire. Let's return to 1940, to the frozen front where this forgotten technology became more than a clever trick. It became a weapon of survival. The reason the Finnish army wielded the long fire with such mastery was not simply military instruction. It was cultural inheritance. In western Siberia and across the Karelian forests, fire was never just a source of warmth. It was a tool for shaping the land itself. Indigenous groups like the Khanty and the Mansi practiced what historians now call traditional pyrotechnics. They burned underbrush to open grazing grounds for reindeer. They renewed berry fields. They kept pests at bay. Fire was not treated as a threat to be imprisoned in a metal stove. It was treated as a living element to be guided, shaped, and understood. This cultural fluency with open flame carried forward into Finnish rural life, and during the Winter War, it transformed into a decisive military advantage. While Soviet troops depended on long, fragile supply lines to deliver kerosene, fuel, and metal stoves, supply lines the Finns sabotaged relentlessly, the Finnish soldiers lived entirely off the land. They used the forest as their pantry, their shelter, and their furnace. A properly built rakovalkeia burns almost smokeless once it finds its rhythm. The combustion inside that narrow gap is so hot and so complete that smoke particles are consumed before they can rise. For soldiers fighting a numerically superior enemy, this was priceless. They could warm themselves through the dead of night without betraying their position to watchful eyes or aircraft scanning for columns of smoke. Accounts from the front tell of Finnish patrols moving with astonishing lightness. They carried almost no bedding. They would ski for miles silently through the night. Then, when exhaustion hit, they stopped, cut 2 dry pines, shaped them with their axes, and within an hour had a radiant heater glowing beside them. They built lean-to shelters from a scrap of canvas or a bed of pine boughs angled just right to capture the fire's horizontal wave of heat. Inside these makeshift shelters, temperatures could climb to a shocking 60 degrees Fahrenheit, while the world beyond the canvas remained locked at -20. It wasn't just warmth. It was a microclimate, human-made, physics-driven, and battlefield-ready. Contrast that with the Soviet experience. Their doctrine leaned on mass, machinery, and fuel, but no amount of industrial power can outvote biology. When core body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, dexterity collapses. Fingers stiffen. You cannot load a rifle. You cannot tie a knot. Below 90 degrees, the mind begins to slip. Victims stop shivering. They stop thinking clearly. Some feel an eerie sense of heat, a fatal trick of the dying brain known as paradoxical undressing. This is why so many Soviet soldiers were found frozen to death within reach of their own fires. Their flames burned upward, feeding the sky, while their bodies quietly crossed the threshold into hypothermia. The long fire became the invisible line of survival, the barrier that kept the Finns on the warm side of human physiology, while their opponents slid unknowingly toward the cold. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was knowledge, centuries old, quietly preserved, almost forgotten, until war forced it back into the light. In the next part, we'll explore why this brilliant fire vanished from mainstream use and why modern society, armed with more technology than ever, lost touch with the very skills that kept our ancestors alive. Part 5. Why we forgot. If this fire is so brilliantly effective, if it can outperform modern gear in temperatures that should shut down the human body, then why isn't everyone using it today? Why do we walk into camping stores filled with $500 sleeping bags, ultralight stoves, chemical warmers, and titanium gadgets, yet not a single manual teaching how to cut and shape a Nodia? The answer is not about firewood. It's about our relationship with nature itself. For most of human history, we lived with the land. Today, we merely visit it. The wilderness used to be our home, now it is a weekend destination. And in that shift, we traded knowledge for convenience. The long fire demands a saw and an axe. It demands standing dead wood, something protected in many national parks. It demands skill, patience, and the confidence to shape a fire the way our ancestors did, not the way a pre-packaged stove instructs us to. It takes around 45 minutes to build correctly. And in a world obsessed with push-button solutions, that sounds like an eternity. We want the flick of a lighter, the click of a gas stove, the snap of a chemical hand warmer. We want heat that arrives instantly, not heat that must be crafted. But as wilderness instructor Mors Kochanski said, with a clarity few modern experts dare to repeat, the more you know, the less you carry. Modern gear is heavy, it is expensive, and most dangerously, it is fragile. A single broken zipper can end the usefulness of a high-end sleeping bag. A gas canister can run empty at the worst possible moment. Down insulation becomes useless once wet. Knowledge, however, cannot break. It cannot run out of fuel. It weighs nothing. It costs nothing. The only way to lose it is to forget it. Yet there is another reason the Nodia fell out of our cultural memory. We are afraid of fire in a way our ancestors were not. We were raised to see fire as a hazard to be confined inside steel rings, fireplaces, or stoves. And that fear isn't unfounded. A long fire burns hot. If built directly on deep snow, it will melt downward until it suffocates itself in the pit it creates. If built beneath a snow-laden tree, it can trigger a sudden collapse of wet snow, soaking a sleeper, extinguishing the fire, and sentencing them to hypothermia in minutes. But the experts of the past solved these problems long before we were born. Siberian trappers and Finnish scouts knew how to build a raft of green logs so the fire floated on snow without sinking. They knew how to read the canopy above them, avoiding branches heavy with powder. And they knew exactly how far to sleep from the logs, usually one deliberate step away, close enough for warmth, far enough for safety. These lessons were earned through generations of trial and error, through nights of hardship, through days of observation, through a relationship with the land that we, in our age of convenience, seldom experience anymore. The tragedy is not that the long fire is difficult. It isn't. The tragedy is that the knowledge survived for thousands of years and then slipped quietly out of our hands in barely a century. In the next part, we'll look at the revival, how modern bushcrafters are rediscovering these techniques and why the long fire may hold the key to surviving the coldest nights of the future. Part 6. The Revival and the Lesson. In the last few years, something remarkable has happened. A technique once whispered about in old military memoirs and buried in the notebooks of Siberian trappers has come back to life. Bushcraft communities, wilderness instructors, and even backyard experimenters have revived the Nodia, testing it not out of nostalgia, but out of genuine curiosity. Could something this old still outperform the best survival gear we have today? The results have been nothing short of astonishing. One YouTuber compared a classic teepee fire to a Siberian log fire on the same winter night. The teepee fire, despite its dramatic flames, collapsed into ash after barely 90 minutes. The Siberian fire, by contrast, glowed fiercely for 14 hours straight, an entire winter night, without a single additional stick of wood. In another experiment, a simple mylar emergency blanket was added as a reflector behind a long fire. The temperature inside the shelter rose by 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit compared to the air outside. Think about that. A flimsy blanket and 2 logs created a climate shift powerful enough to mean the difference between frostbite and comfort. But the real lesson of the long fire isn't the burn time or the temperature, it's the mindset behind it. The people who perfected this fire Sami herders, Siberian trappers, medieval woodsmen, didn't walk into a frozen forest and see danger. They saw potential. They saw fuel already seasoned by the wind, insulation waiting in the soil, reflectors waiting in the snow. They weren't relying on equipment, they were relying on understanding. Radiation, reflection, insulation. The laws of physics were not their enemies. They were tools. Today we often look back at pre-industrial life through a filter of pity. We imagine our ancestors shivering in crude shelters, wishing desperately for Gore-Tex, propane, and GPS. But when you read accounts of a Siberian hunter stretched out beside his Nodia, boots drying, steam rising, stars glimmering through the smoke hole of his shelter, you realize the truth is very different. They weren't merely surviving, they were living. They were warm, comfortable, secure, and above all, at home in an environment we consider extreme. And that is perhaps the most humbling part of this entire story. We now spend thousands of dollars on ultralight tents, insulated clothing, and high-tech heating solutions just to spend a single night in the wilderness. Meanwhile, a medieval fire built from 2 logs and a bit of knowledge could give you the same warmth, the same comfort, the same safety, without batteries, without fuel, without fear. The revival of the long fire is not just a return to an old technique, it is a reminder that nature has always provided everything we need, if we know how to look for it. In the final part, we'll explore why this ancient fire is more relevant now than ever, and how embracing this forgotten knowledge could change the way we face the cold, the wilderness, and even the limits of our own resilience. Conclusion: the fire that never goes out. As we reach the end of this journey, I want you to hold on to a single image. Picture 2 logs, silent, unremarkable, resting side by side, yet burning with a slow, steady pulse, strong enough to push back a night of -40 cold. Not with noise, not with fury, but with patience, physics, and wisdom. The next time you step outside on a cold evening or sit comfortably inside a warm home, think of that fire. Think of the Nodia. Think of how something so simple, so quiet, could stand against conditions that shut down engines, froze steel, and drained the life from soldiers who trusted technology more than understanding. Because the greatest survival tool you will ever have is not one you can buy. It is not stitched from synthetic fibers or powered by fuel canisters. It is knowledge. It is the understanding that a cold, dead tree can become a radiant shelter, that geometry can be warmer than Gore-Tex, that wisdom, passed down through centuries, can save a life long after gadgets fail. Experts once looked at this fire and dismissed it as primitive. But on those brutal nights in 1940, when machine oil thickened into jelly and tank engines froze solid on the battlefield, it was the so-called primitive fire that kept burning. And it was the men who trusted it, men who slept beside that glowing seam of heat, who lived to tell the story. Perhaps, after everything we've seen, it's time we relearned how to build it. I'm Historia Prime. Stay warm, stay curious, and never stop learning from the past. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into survival history, tap that like button. It truly helps the channel grow. Then tell me in the comments, if you were stranded in a winter wilderness, would you trust your gear or would you trust the fire? Until next time. What if the greatest winter survival tool wasn't inside a $500 sleeping bag, but hidden inside a medieval fire your ancestors built with nothing more than 2 logs and physics? In this episode of Historia Prime, we expose the forgotten heating system that modern experts dismissed as primitive until battlefield evidence proved otherwise. This is the fire that outperformed industrial heaters in -20 degrees Fahrenheit blizzards, the fire that kept soldiers alive while tanks froze solid, the fire that turned a frozen forest into a life-saving metabolic bomb of radiant heat. For decades, we trusted gear, synthetic insulation, propane stoves, engineered fabrics. But when the cold triggers a biological betrayal, when your body slows, when your heat output drops, all that gear becomes a silent failure. The Nodia, the ancient longfire, sidesteps that trap entirely, cutting through the freezing chemical soup of winter air and creating a microclimate warm enough to save your life. This is not just history, it's a wake-up call, a reminder that knowledge weighs nothing and sometimes outperforms everything. Watch to the end. You'll never look at fire or cold the same way again.